Hi, I'm Jim Ward of the Middle Country Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode in our History Bites series. Today we will discuss the 1992 presidential election, which featured a third-party candidate, Ross Perot, getting the highest share of the vote won by a candidate outside of the two major parties since 1912. At the end of the Persian Gulf War, President George H.W. Bush seemed certain to win a second term. After only 6 weeks of airstrikes and 100 hours of ground fighting, U.S. troops, along with their coalition partners, had won an overwhelming victory over Iraq when combat operations ended on February 27, 1991. A record 89% of the American people approved of Bush's performance in office. No preceding post-World War II president had ever achieved such a high level of public support in the Gallup poll. Bush's popularity did not last, however. The economy sank into recession in late 1990. By the middle of 1991, the unemployment rate had climbed to 7.8%, the highest level since the early 1980s. When Bush announced he was running for a second term in February 1992, his approval rating had plunged to 41%. When he accepted the Republican presidential nomination at the party's national convention in Houston in July, only 29% of the American people thought he was doing a good job as president. At the Republican National Convention in 1988, Bush had pledged to the delegates that he would resist any tax increases, giving his famous "Read My Lips" pledge. But in 1990, in an attempt to cope with a soaring budget deficit, Bush reneged on that pledge, earning him the enmity of his conservative supporters and the distrust of many voters who backed him in 1988. Pat Buchanan led an insurgent campaign against Bush, capturing nearly 37% of the vote in the New Hampshire primary. Despite the challenge, Bush went on to win the Republican nomination, though his candidacy was wounded. The Democratic race was intense. With Iowa Senator Tom Harkin running, the major Democratic candidates skipped the Iowa caucuses. The frontrunner appeared to be Clinton, but other candidates, in particular former California Governor Jerry Brown and former Massachusetts Senator Paul Tsongas, hoped to secure the nomination. Though Tsongas won in New Hampshire, Clinton scored a strong second-place showing, a performance which he labeled himself the comeback kid. Clinton nearly swept the Super Tuesday primaries held on March 10th, and by March, Tsongas would withdraw from the contest. Still, Brown continued to challenge Clinton, who had not amassed the requisite number of delegates to secure the Democratic nomination until June 2nd, when he defeated Brown in California and several other states. Complicating the campaigns for both Clinton and Bush was the third-party candidacy of billionaire business owner Ross Perot. Perot had acquired a huge personal fortune from a data processing company, and this made his independent bid for the presidency possible. During the Reagan administration, he insisted that the government had not done enough to ensure a full accounting of the fates of American prisoners of war or missing in action in Vietnam. As his criticisms became more extreme, then Vice President Bush had the task of informing Perot that the administration would cease cooperating with him. Perot carried a grudge. One campaign aide declared that if Perot could prevent Bush's re-election, he would be on top of the world. He hates George Bush. His United We Stand America citizens group promised a White House dedicated to patriotism, candor, honesty, and a balanced budget. Dissatisfied voters of all stripes flocked to his call, creating one of the most powerful third-party movements in American history. Perot was riding high in the polls when he suddenly announced in July that he was withdrawing from the race. He claimed he did not want to be responsible for an election that had no winner and one that required the House of Representatives to choose the next president. Then, just as abruptly, he re-entered the race in October. Polls suggested he would indeed siphon votes away from both Bush and Clinton. Bush could ill afford any such losses. He was trailing Clinton by double digits in the polls, and 78% of the American people believed that under him, the country was moving in the wrong direction. When the three candidates met in Richmond, Virginia on October 15th for a debate, economic concerns were at the center of the discussion. An audience of undecided voters posed the questions. A young woman asked Bush about how the recession had affected him personally. Bush began by looking at his watch and then argued about the unfairness of assuming that someone who was prosperous could not understand the plight of the unemployed. Clinton walked up to the questioner and explained how, as governor of a small state, he knew the names of workers who had lost their jobs and factory owners who had closed their businesses. He claimed that the Bush administration had slowed job creation and eroded wages. Perot's policies focused on opposition to the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, supported by both Bush and Clinton, and on elimination of the country's budget deficit and national debt. He had snappy remarks about Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush. The Texas businessman conceded his lack of political experience before adding sharply, quote, "I don't have any experience in running up a $4 trillion debt. I don't have any experience in gridlock government where nobody takes responsibility for anything and everybody blames everybody else," end quote. President Bush wrote in his diary on March 18, 1991 that, quote, "The common wisdom is that I'll win in a runaway, but I don't believe that. I think it will be the economy which will make that determination," end quote. The election of 1992 proved he was right. On Election Day, November 3, 1992, Clinton, on the strength of his middle-of-the-road approach, defeated Bush and Perot, winning 43% of the vote to Bush's 37.4% and Perot's 18.9%. In the Electoral College, Clinton's victory was more dramatic. He captured 370 electoral votes to Bush's 168, thus ending 12 years of Republican control of the presidency. Perot drew support from both parties, winning approximately 19% of the popular vote, but no electoral votes. Clinton had delivered on his promise to do well in traditional Democratic strongholds, to win back large numbers of Reagan Democrats, and to attract middle-class Republicans. However, when his vote is compared to the combined Bush and Perot totals in 1992, it is clear that Clinton was a minority president. On the other hand, a larger percentage, 55% of the electorate, voted in 1992 than in 1988, 1984, and 1980. And when the Clinton and Perot popular vote totals are combined, 62%, the 1992 election amounts to a dramatic vote for change. The 1992 election ended with results that haven't been seen since that election. Perot won 18.9% of the popular vote, the highest share of the vote won by a candidate outside of the two major political parties since 1912. Although he failed to win any electoral votes, his candidacy resulted in no state giving an absolute majority to any candidate except Clinton's home state of Arkansas. It is also the final election to date in which the Democratic nominee won less than 50% of the vote in California, Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, Illinois, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, and Vermont, and in which the Republican nominee won less than 50% in Alabama, Alaska, Idaho, Kansas, and Nebraska. It is also the third and final election since the Civil War in which a Republican or Democratic nominee failed to break 50% in a single state, the first two being 1912 for William Howard Taft and 1984 for Walter Mondale. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for today's episode. If you enjoyed it, click like, and if you watched on YouTube, hit subscribe. Thanks so much, and we'll see you all next time.